All right, everybody. Hey, how you doing today? Happy Thursday, Wednesday. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Thursday for my other group. It's Dr. J here. I just wanted to make sure I came on and talked to you guys and still had class. I'm at a conference right now, and I know that we still wanted to get in. Sorry, my camera's a little shady. We still wanted to make sure that we had class time. So I'm so grateful that everybody was able to still be here today. And this is definitely a special shout out for my dual enrollment classes, for my high school students, early college academy. I know that Ms. Diaz and Mr. Groves is holding it down. So thank y'all so much. And this is our class time for today. So today we will be continuing our conversation. Actually, let's take a step back. First and foremost, I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. This week, our next assignment is due, and our second assignment is due, and that assignment is our outline assignment. And that outline assignment is really designed to give you the opportunity to take your thesis statement and to break the thesis statement down so that you can have more content to be able to write about. And I think I mentioned this before, and I want to reiterate, if you find that as you're doing your outline, that your thesis statement isn't as solid as you want it to be, it's totally okay for you to use a different thesis statement and to change that. That's totally fine. In fact, as soon as I finish doing this Zoom video, I am going to grade you guys' work so I can let you know what your thesis statement is working with, if it's good, if it needs some adjustment. I'll let you guys know that by the end of the night. But definitely know that the thesis statement is flexible. In fact, I'm actually thinking and I'm hoping that as you guys do this outline, that you'll notice the gaps that you might have in your thought process and in your writing, because sometimes, things seem one way in our heads, but when we actually put them on paper, they start looking totally, totally, totally different. So I just want to make sure that I reiterate that it's okay to have this as a working document. It's okay for you to be able to make changes to the thesis statement. All of that is fine. And remember, the whole goal is for everybody to be able to produce quality work to get the full credit for this assignment. There should be nobody and no reason why you have any zeros or any discrepancies in the point. So definitely think about your ability to communicate what you understand in your head and make sure that it's translated on your work. And remember, this essay, the focus of this essay is about why slave codes changed the course of history. Why did slave codes impact America's culture, especially when you talk about African people's experience of America? Okay, so I can't emphasize that enough. This paper is designed to really get you to explore why did this change the course of history. And in your analysis, you might want to mention the legacy of white supremacy. You might want to mention the legacy of racial hierarchies and social hierarchies within society. You might want to mention the general colonial project of what it meant to take something of some other communities and some other cultures and make it to basically debo it and to call it your own and to take it over. And so when you talk about this whole culture of deboing, of taking, um, of control, then within that context, you definitely have space to talk about slave codes. And so as we explore this topic, I really want you guys to focus on why was this such a big deal? And what were some of the social trends? And I want to say this before I forget. One of the things that I do want to offer you as you are writing your essay is the essay prompt asks you to describe social trends that may have been caused because of this historical event of the slave codes being implemented in society. And so when you think about social trends, I want you to also consider what are some of the things that we see still to this day in terms of the policing of Black bodies and the policing of poor people's bodies, the policing of people's bodies just in general. And one of the things that comes to my mind is that we've made it a trend in a way of um, recognizing that the legal system is not always serving justice to people of color. That's been a social trend. That's been something that we definitely see during the era of the slave codes. We definitely have had examples in that one particular article when we were reading about the different types of slave codes that Virginia had. And we saw that there were so many different things that, so many moments that we see that African people were seeking justice in some kind of way, and were absolutely denied from the courts that opportunity for justice to be served. And so that becomes a trend within our society. That's something that we see over and over and over. And I have to be honest, obviously we still see it today. So again, think about why this particular historical event of slave codes, why did that change the course of history? And consider the not only the creation and the implementation, but also the enforcement and the social trends that kind of come from this moment. So think about it. You guys got it. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I want us to learn some really cool things today. But definitely do your best work. And again, I will take my time as soon as I finish this video to make sure that I grade you guys this paper, your thesis statements, and give you some good feedback. Okay. All right. So let's take a step back. We started off last class doing a huge overview so that we could be caught up on the timeline of what this course is all about. And remember, the course is about Africans' experience in the United States. And really, we're focusing on the colonial period all the way up to the Civil War era. And as we are talking about this, you know, last time we were together, I wanted to bring up the impact of the cotton industry. And the impact of the cotton industry is a real thing. It's a real thing. And there's many ways to look at slavery. There's many ways to look at slavery. But one of the things that I want to bring to the forefront with this module is what cotton, the demand for cotton, actually does to our society, okay? Or did to the society. And it's almost like having, you know, a really hot product and knowing that everybody wants this product and never wanting to run out of this product. And the demand for this product is super, 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 super intense. And it's a good thing if the product wasn't necessarily something that was derived from violence and exploitation, but the product itself creates a huge, intense environment. Everybody wanted this new product called cotton. Okay. And the environment that this demand is going to create is going to influence the type of violence and the types of culture that is going to be created, because the need is so strong for this exploited labor. The need for this free labor to produce this cotton is extremely intense. And so I sometimes want to give you the notion to consider, what did the demand and the industry of cotton just by itself, what did that do to society, and how impactful was this thing called cotton? So I want to begin by first giving you kind of like an overview of the cotton is king kind of sentiment, and what does that look like? How do we define that? How do we describe that? So I'm going to share my video. And I hope this is doing this right, because I haven't really recorded something before on Zoom or shared my screen by recording something. But I want us to start off, and I think that I can share the sound as well. Share sound, share. Okay, how about this, guys? Let me stop the share. Let me share the sound. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's start off watching this.
My name's Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. So If you look at the tag on the shirt that you're wearing, you'll probably find that at least a portion of it is made of cotton. I mean, cotton is everywhere. It's in our shirts, in our pants, in curtains and blankets, and so many other things that we don't even realize. But even though that cotton on your back was meant to keep you comfortable, the historical reality of the United States is that the cotton industry was built on the backs of black folks. A lot of cotton is grown in the hot and humid climate of the southern United States. And a lot of this country's wealth was built on the cotton trade. But it's easy to forget that part of the reason that cotton was so lucrative in early America was because it was harvested with the labor of enslaved people. And even though the dirty work of the cotton industry took place mainly in the southern states, many white people in the northern United States gained their fortunes through the exploitation of enslaved workers in the South. And the reason that cotton became such a central economic pillar was not just because of what was happening in the US, but because of an entire global financial network that, whether they sanctioned the use of slavery themselves or not, incentivized the use of enslaved labor to satisfy the enormous international demand for cotton. It's time we learn about how cotton became king. Let's start the show. By the time of the Civil War, the United States was wealthy. I'm talking Scrooge McDuck swimming in golden coins rich. It had become one of the major slave trading capitals of the world and a major exporter of cotton. According to scholar Henry Louis Gates, cotton was the first mass consumer commodity, which is just a fancy way of saying that everybody in the world wanted it. They wanted it for their clothes, for their blankets, for their rugs, for their socks. I mean, demand across the globe was exploding. The cotton industry was so powerful that it not only grew the US economy, but many economies in Europe as well. But most nations couldn't compete with the United States production level. According to historian Edward Baptist, the North American interior had thousands of acres of possible cotton fields, thousands for each one in the Caribbean. And in order to develop all of this land, there was a greater need for laborers to work the cotton plantations of the South and mid-Atlantic United States. And as had become standard practice in the US in the 18th and 19th centuries, the plan was for most of these laborers to be enslaved black people. Enslaved labor and cotton went hand in hand to produce profit. And the work, it was more than just backbreaking. It was torture. Charles Ball, a black man and author who escaped slavery, wrote that the brutality of the cotton industry was enough to make an individual contemplate taking their own life. He said in his 1837 autobiography, Slavery in the United States, quote, "Surely if anything can justify a man in taking his life into his own hands and terminating his existence, no one can attach blame to the slaves on many of the cotton plantations of the South when they cut short their breath and the agonies of the present being by a single stroke. What is life worth amidst hunger, nakedness, and excessive toil under the continually uplifted lash?" It really doesn't get more clear than that. And in 1793, the cotton gin arrived, and it transformed the cotton industry, the global economy, and in horrific ways, the lives of enslaved people. The cotton gin significantly ramped up cotton production in the United States, especially in South Carolina and Georgia. Let's check that out in the thought bubble. Before 1793, separating the sticky seeds from cotton was a laborious task. Then, the mechanical cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney, made the process much faster and easier than it had ever been. What would happen is that cotton would be threaded through a wooden drum filled with hooks that caught hold of the fibers and pulled them through a mesh. The holes in that mesh were too small to allow the seeds through, but the cotton fibers themselves were easily pulled through. While some larger gins would later be powered by horses and even steam engines, Whitney used a smaller version. Whitney's hand-cranked machine could remove the seeds from 50 pounds of cotton in a single day. What this meant was that planters needed a way to grow and pick more cotton to keep up with the new accelerated pace of processing. And at the same time, market conditions in Europe meant cotton was more desirable than ever. What this meant was that planters needed even more labor from even more enslaved workers than they did before. Demand for other industrial cotton machinery grew as well, like new machines for spinning cotton or steamboats to transport massive bales of it. This drastically changed the American economic landscape. By the 1850s, cotton provided 3/5 of American exports, and the yield of raw cotton doubled every decade after 1800. By some estimates, the United States supplied 3/4 of the global supply of cotton by the start of the Civil War. If cotton wasn't king before, it certainly was now. Thanks, Thought Bubble. The economic impact of the cotton industry on the United States and the enslaved people whose labor sustained it is very clear. Again, historian Edward Baptist writes, all told, more than $600 million, or almost half of the economic activity in the United States in 1836, derived directly or indirectly from cotton produced by the million-odd slaves, 6% of the total U.S. population, who in that year toiled in labor camps on slavery's frontier. And again, it wasn't just the United States, it was the world. Most of the Western world's economies benefited from the cotton industry. Historian Gene Daddle argues that cotton produced by enslaved people was the driving force for territorial expansion in the Old Southwest and fostered trade between Europe and the United States. Major northern cities, like New York City, needed raw cotton for their own industries. New England was also seriously dependent on raw cotton for the textile revolution. New England mills consumed 283.7 million pounds of cotton, or 67% of the cotton used by U.S. mills in 1860. So any notion that the North wasn't intimately involved in slavery is something that we should immediately toss out the window. Abroad, countries like Britain and France also depended on raw cotton. According to Gene Daddle, Britain, the most powerful nation in the world, relied on slave-produced cotton for over 80% of its essential industrial raw material. English textile mills accounted for 40% of Britain's exports. 1/5 of Britain's 22 million people were directly or indirectly involved with cotton textiles. And it didn't stop there. One of the main causes of the Civil War was cotton, and the status of the enslaved laborers who produced that cotton. Southern slaveholders were so financially attached to the cotton industry that they were willing to go to war over it. And at the end of the war, cotton was one of the bargaining tools that the South used to assure that they would still have a place and political power in the Union. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get to the Civil War soon. Now, let's do some deeper thinking about the economic implications of slavery. In 1860, in large part tied to the explosion of the cotton industry, the 4 million enslaved people in the United States were worth more than all of the railroads and factories in the nation combined. Those enslaved workers were worth more than all of the manufacturing in the United States. So Black people's labor has played an enormous role in America's ascent as a global economic superpower. But enslaved people themselves didn't get to reap the benefits of the economic explosion they created. The vast majority of Black folks were not allowed to own any property. And if they did, it could be seized from them at any moment, without them being able to do much of anything about it. Even when slavery was abolished, the sharecropping system in the South worked in similar ways, plunging Black Americans and their families into devastating debt, while they owned nothing of their own. The implications of this are profound. Let's step back and consider that intergenerational chattel slavery in the United States, in which Black people rarely owned their own land, lasted for 250 years before ending, technically at least, in 1865. Let's then consider that sharecropping, in which enormous numbers of Black people continued to not own their own land, lasted well into the 1950s and arguably later. This directly impacts generational wealth in the United States today. If your family was able to accrue income, equity, and mobility by owning land that produced cotton, or any other crop for that matter, and then pass it down across generations, it would quite naturally leave your descendants in a more economically secure position than those who came before them. But Black folks, despite working the land, cultivating the land, and picking the cotton and crops that grew on the land, for the most part, didn't have any opportunity to reap the financial benefits of that land. What this did was leave many Black families, well after slavery ended and into the 20th century, with little, if anything, to pass down to their children, something that shapes the sort of opportunities that their descendants would or would not have. And this gap between white and Black people is compounded decade after decade after decade until it's no longer a gap in wealth, it's a gulf. Cotton was the United States' biggest export for more than a century. That's more than 100 years of wealth creation and industry that Black Americans not only carried on their backs, but were designated to never profit from. I mean, calling it a head start for white people doesn't even accurately capture it. It wasn't just a head start. It was like you were running while the person you're racing against had chains on their feet and death threats in their ears. So when we talk about creating a more equitable nation, part of what we have to think about is how to account for and make amends for what was done to people and what was kept from people for generations. The question remains, how can we compensate those who this country purposefully left behind? Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is made with the help of all these nice people.
All right. That was a great introduction to cotton and why cotton itself was such a major product. There's some things that I want to take from the video and I want to emphasize. The first thing I want to take away from the video and emphasize is that most of the people who benefited from cotton are people that could possibly exist today, okay? These benefactors off of this free labor and the cotton that it produced didn't just disappear after the Civil War. They didn't just disappear into the oblivion once cotton no longer was a thing or slavery was no longer a thing. Many businesses, many empires, many corporations quite literally were founded on the backs of the cotton industry. And I also want to make sure that I mention this, that y'all see how interwoven the industry was. It wasn't just the ground level of picking the cotton, but then there also are manufacturing companies that process the cotton. There are textile companies that process and manipulate the cotton as well. There are so many people involved in this network of a business that, as the gentleman says towards the end of the video, accounting for fixing the grievances that occurred by the descendants of Africans and comparing that with those who have benefited, it's incomparable. There is no compensation that could really capture how much was taken from African people for real, in the course of the cotton industry. And when you just think of the practicality of it, it's hard to really get into monetizing, putting a number on how much money really would be due to African people because of just the cotton industry by itself. The millions of dollars that was made. And keep in mind, this is seed money too. So you might have started off with $1 million from the cotton industry, but then you flipped it and got into another industry, and now you're a billionaire, a multimillionaire. That's a very real thing for us to have to look at, is the expansiveness of the industry of cotton and how many layers and how many people were actually involved in this whole entire industry. Another thing that I want to point out as we're looking at this cotton is king moment is, as I mentioned to you before, the increased demand for labor, free labor, to pick this cotton is going to exacerbate the violence that you see on the cotton plantations. And it's the equivalent of me, oh, I just had a new thought. It's the equivalent of me almost needing, y'all know, in elementary school and in middle school, take your brain back to those days when you would take these standardized tests. And standardized tests at one point, I remember being in Georgia, and this was such a big deal that standardized tests were measurements that pretty much let school districts know if the teachers were doing a good job or not. And the pressure to perform was so intense that people quite literally would just drill students and inundate them with information because they needed them. They needed them to pass these tests and to make the marks of whatever standard was on their agenda to meet. Okay. That culture within education at that time created such a toxic environment and such an intense environment that you literally had a principal kind of inflate the numbers for her test results for her school. And this was an Atlantic public school system. And she eventually got arrested for that. And the teachers that were a part of that also got arrested for that. And I want to say that their trial just actually ended recently in the last maybe 2 or 3 years. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that pressure really does bust pipes or it makes diamonds. And if you think about the intensity of the cotton industry, you're seeing pressure genuinely for these farmers to produce cotton at a very, very big level, at a very big level. And so, of course, they're going to be mean. Of course, they're going to be inconsiderate. Of course, they're going to be disrespectful. Of course, their biggest goal is productivity. And so when you talk about slavery, you have to realize the culture of what the cotton industry created. And as we talked about last class, one of the things that we see is that it created a very, very violent situation, but even more so, a sexually violent situation towards men, children, and women. Okay. Today, I want to bring your attention to some other elements of the cotton industry. So let me go back to our okay. The next thing I want to bring your attention to, I need to get some water. My throat is dry. We're going to get to that in just a second. We're going to actually do that last. I want to bring your attention to this slave breeding farm. And for some reason, this is not pulling up, but I don't know why it's not pulling up. Image options. Okay, we'll fix that. Sorry, guys. This is really annoying that these images don't always show up properly in our system, and that's super annoying. We gotta have our pictures. Thank you guys for your patience. I apologize. I had to fix that real quick because that was gonna drive me crazy. Okay, so the thing that I want to mention now, and I want to pivot for a second, we're going to end our conversation today by going back to one of the other pages and listening to a lecture from a man that wrote a book, and I think his name was actually mentioned in the video. His name was Edward Baptiste, and he wrote a book called The Half Has Never Been Told, and it's really about the other side, the other perspective of the cotton industry from those who did not benefit from it. In terms of the African, the African people that picked the cotton. So I want to make sure that I say this, and I want to describe this very clearly. Cotton in itself was a business, okay? The selling, the production, the textiles, the manufacturing of cotton was definitely an industry and was definitely a thing. But you also see that people were also a product, okay? So it wasn't just cotton that drove the industry. The need for labor also is going to create another market, another industry, which is the buying, the selling, the cultivating, the breeding of African bodies as well. Okay. So there's a moment when we talked about the Ma'afa that you start seeing the egregious nature of the journey. And there are many companies, there are many countries, there are many people that want to get out of the transportation of African people from West Africa to the Caribbean, to South America, to North America. They want to get out of the business because the business is really intense. As we see with the story of the Zong, it can be really costly and really expensive, right? You aren't always guaranteed to arrive safely. That's not always a guarantee. And that industry of transporting the bodies, of trafficking the bodies, that industry is going to change. And eventually it's going to stop. And people are going to outlaw or ban or make it illegal to traffic the bodies from West Africa to the Caribbean, to Mexico, to South America and North America. And so because of this, we still need more bodies. Where are we going to get the bodies from if we can't take them straight from Africa? Well, somebody gets the big idea to say, well, we don't have to get them from Africa. We can make them right here on this land, in this country, in this time period, right? We can use Black bodies to reproduce more Black bodies. And so they start to create an industry of not just trafficking bodies, but producing bodies as well. And so we see the crazy implementation of breeding farms, okay? I want to bring this to your attention because we have a really good article in our module that talks about breeding farms, slave breeding farms, okay? And if we were in class together, then this would be something that I would want you to read, and we would read popcorn style, paragraph to paragraph to paragraph to paragraph. But because we are not together, I don't even know how to facilitate pulling names and calling people out to be able to read this article. But I really want y'all to read this because it's very curious to even understand how African bodies were still being used in a very, very strategic way. And remember, the demand of the cotton industry means that I need more bodies, I need more people, I need more laborers. And because I can't necessarily traffic them across the transatlantic station, that's my daughter. Because I can't traffic these bodies, I have to find another way of creating them. And so I do so by getting farms, breeding farms, okay? I'm gonna pause this for just a second. Oh, Risha, I gotta get some water. My throat is dry as hell. Oh, hold on, I gotta do my work. I got to do my work. You still on your? Yeah, I had to pause it. I could hear it in my voice, like, and it's hurting. Where you going? Hold on, I'm still doing my work, okay? How much longer you gonna be? The week, come on, girl, let's go cook some more. I got it living on this, it's gonna come on my whole entire class time, which is an hour and 30 minutes, 20 minutes. So I'm almost there on this. Doing my work. Oh, that's much better. What you got for me? What you got for me? You got some more toys? All right. I think that did it. Okay. So if we were together, I would have you guys go ahead and read this slave reading article, but we're not together. So definitely take the time to read through this. I would love for you to really get a sense of it, but because we're together, oh man, none of these pictures are showing up. I really don't like that. So I'm gonna fix this for you guys. But I do want to read you the very beginning, okay? And so story time. Huddle up, everybody. All right, here we go. Slave breeding. This is American abolitionism and slave breeding discourse by Gregory Smithers. Abolitionists define slave breeding as the coercive reproduction of new generations of slave laborers for sale and resale. He added that slave breeding practices highlighted the immoral commodification of reproductive sexuality in the Caribbean and North American plantation societies. It was impossible to talk about slave breeding, abolitionists maintain, without also discussing the emotional and physical abuse that slave breeding schemes had on enslaved women, the anguish such practices caused when a husband, a wife, and or children were separated and sold away from family, and the violence and exploitative power that the slave owning and slave trading classes exercised over enslaved people. African American memories and representations of slave breeding began taking shape in this politically charged atmosphere and era of cultural sentimentalism. But before we delve into an analysis of these memories and representations, it is important to begin with the comparative overview of anti-slavery and abolitionist discourse, from which these representations entered popular and political culture at the end of the 18th century. The representation of slave breeding practices ultimately coalesced around a general moral aversion to physical and emotional brutality in bourgeois cultures during the 1840s and 1850s. Alarming predictions of slave breeding in the Caribbean, in the British Caribbean, became an increasingly common part of British debate about slavery during the first third of the 19th century. This was because abolitionists had been so successful in abolishing the transatlantic slave trade that 18th century predictions became early 19th century reports of Caribbean plantation owners and overseers boasting of the success of their breeding schemes. Adam Hochschild observes that the operators of the Warrington plantation in Barbados claimed to have increased its slave population following the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807, thanks to breeding. I so am sorry to everybody. There's no way for me to edit this. I thought I was pausing the entire thing. I hope that I did that right. Okay, so we were in the middle of reading, so let's continue to read. Alarming predictions of slave breeding in the British Caribbean became increasingly common part of British debate about slavery during the first third of the 19th century. This was because abolitionists had been so successful in abolishing the transatlantic slave trade late in the 18th century that late 18th century predictions became early 19th century reports of Caribbean plantation owners and overseers boasting of the success of their breeding schemes. Adam Hochschild observes that the operators of the Codrington plantation in Barbados claimed to have increased its slave population following the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807, thanks to breeding schemas. So what does that mean? That means that even though they weren't transporting bodies, they were starting to increase the level of production in the breeding of African people. The great leader of British abolitionism, William Wilberforce, could not ignore these reports. He explained the unintended consequences of the British slave trade's abolition by suggesting that only after the abolition of the international slave trade would men apply their minds in earnest to effect the establishment of the breeding system. But men turning their minds to something does not always mean that they will meet success. Much of the historical debate about slave breeding in the Caribbean is in reality a story of the trials and failures of Caribbean planters to stimulate reproduction among enslaved populations. Nonetheless, failure did not prevent British plantation owners from urging their overseers to implement practices designed to encourage the rapid increase in the slave labor force. On the Georgia estate in Jamaica, for example, plantation owner Thomas Gordon received word from his overseers in the 1820s and 1830s that consistent increases in slave population size were unattainable. In account ledgers that list slave births and deaths alongside those for livestock, Gordon could read for himself the failure of efforts to stimulate slave production. Over the course of the 1820s and 1830s, slight increases in the slave population were recorded. However, by the 1830s, things changed dramatically. From 1832 to 1833, for instance, the number of adult slaves of reproductive age decreased from 168 to 154. Illness, disease, death, rebellions, and runaways, in addition to the use of contraceptives among the slaves, may account for the drop in the adult population and a decline in the number of newborn and infant children. So again, this is one of those things that I wanted to bring your attention to, that cotton itself is an industry, no doubt, no doubt, no doubt. But people were also a part of that industry. The business, the product, the production of producing people were also a part of that industry. I think I mentioned to one of my classes that usually you only see breeding things related to animals and livestock. But this really just kind of indicates how much of a disconnect that many of the colonizers and many of the European plantation owners really had when it came to assessing that African people were actually human beings. You can't necessarily breed people. That's ridiculous. And so this particular issue found a new voice within the works of a woman by the name of Phyllis Wheatley. And you have the opportunity to read a poem of Phyllis Wheatley here. Excuse me. And then this article goes in to really kind of describe, to you some of the women that spoke out against slave breeding. As you can imagine, this was a very intense culture for African women who were producing 15, 16, ridiculous numbers of children in one lifetime. It's insane levels of breeding, okay? One of the most popular voices that we see, and I really hate that her picture is not showing up, is from a woman named Harriet Jacobs. And Harriet Jacobs was probably about the most famous person to really vocalize and describe what happened, what her experience was as an African woman during her enslavement. And so she writes in her in an autobiography, I believe that she produced, that no pen can give an adequate description of all the pervading corruption produced by slavery. The slave girl is reared in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear. The lash and the foul talk of her master and his sons are her teachers. When she's 14 or 15, her owner or his sons or the overseer, or perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she's whipped or starved into submission to their will. She may have had religious principles inculcated by some pious mother or grandmother or some good mistress. She may have had a lover whose good opinion and peace of mind are dear to her heart, or the profligate men who have power over her may be exceedingly odious to her, but resistance to all of this is hopeless. That's just a small clip of Harriet Jacobs' writing. And it's very interesting to be able to see from a woman's perspective what slave breeding really was all about. So I want to take a second now to go back in our module. Bring your attention to this particular article, How Slavery Became America's First Big Business. This is a really good article because this whole entire module is about capitalism and slavery. And I want to make sure that I take a second first to describe what is capitalism. I think that everybody can understand at this point that this country is built off of the economic system of capitalism. Other economic systems do exist in the world, though, not just ours. In certain countries, communism is the economic system. Socialism is another economic system that you might be familiar with. What's interesting is that capitalism is all about markets and business and the production and selling of capital, capital being products, capital being goods. One of the first elements of capitalism is having something to produce or having something to sell. Cotton was definitely one of America's leading industries, but slavery was the first really big business of the colonial era. Okay, and so this particular page really talks about a gentleman by the name of Edward Baptiste, and he wrote a book, and this book is called The Half Has Never Been Told. It's a very popular book, and it's about slavery in the making of American capitalism. And so for the rest of our class together, we have a little less than about 30 minutes or so on my timer. I wanted us to watch this particular video. Again, if we had the means, we would read this out loud, but because we're doing this on Zoom, and I hope that this is going well, hopefully it is. If it's not, I'm sure your instructors are going to troubleshoot as they need. But if we were together, then we would just read this. But since we're not, I was able to find a really cool video of Edward Baptiste doing a lecture of this book. And so he kind of gives you an overview of the same things that we will be reading here on this page. And before I forget, I also want to encourage you guys to do your own research. You know, understanding how major of an industry cotton is a very powerful tool in your toolkit. Being able to even understand things like the slave codes. And down the line, we're going to talk about other things in terms of reparations and other issues. And so this is a really great opportunity for you to talk about, for you to understand how the nature of the cotton industry really impacted African-American people. And so let's watch for the remainder of our time together. Just a few words that Edward Baptiste has to say about his work and his book.
All right, let me start with a story. See if I can get this to advance. And this story begins in Attala County, Mississippi, which see outlined in red there, in 1833. That's when a man named Charles Thompson was born. And he didn't know it at the time, of course. He was just an infant. But he was born on a double frontier, a chronological one and a geographical one. So geographically, Atala was the edge of cotton country. And in Mississippi, cotton country actually marched inland from the Mississippi River. In fact, in 1833, that was a very significant year, one of several years in which big efforts were being made to push the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians out of the remaining 40% of Mississippi, which was mostly northeast from there, which the original owners of Mississippi still held on to. Andrew Jackson's administration was working hard to make this happen. But Charles was also born on a chronological frontier. By 1833, the year of his birth, the commercial production of cotton had been driving American expansion into the Mississippi Valley for 40 years. And the drive was at that point accelerating. American cotton had already come from nowhere, less than 1% of all world cotton production in 1790, to dominate the world market for cotton. And by the 1830s, its share of the British cotton market, which was the most important one in the world, would rise to 80% or higher. And that was a growing market, which makes the increasing American dominance all that more impressive. The commodity market for cotton was growing just as fast as the industrial textile sector that cotton fed. And cotton came from the fields that Charles Thompson was destined to toil in. This is a chronological frontier in an even bigger scale than just the history of cotton itself. After 9,000 years of slow growth subsistence agricultural economics, in 1833, society's ability to produce goods and services was clearly beginning, at least in Western Europe and North America, to increase rapidly. People knew they were in the midst of a historical transformation. And looking back, we know very well that 19th century industrialization began with cotton textiles. Inventors in Britain had created new machines that could spin and weave cotton into cloth. Cloth was always one of the most important trade goods in any human society. And these machines could do it faster than ever, and they could do it a little bit faster each year. And as a result of this process of industrialization, the entire world was changing. As a factory system emerged, raw cotton became the most in-demand commodity on the world market. Southern enslavers had been able to seize control over that market. Of course, if cotton entrepreneurs could not continue to supply the ever-growing demand for that commodity in ever greater quantity, it was possible that prices would rise and the commodity would in turn become a cord that would choke off growth. So as Charles Thompson came into the world, dynamic systems that were changing rapidly, we're already churning, we're already growing, we're already transforming the world around him. And the changes were the classic shifts that have made the external world of modern social and political and economic history. We've been trying to explain them ever since. We've been even trying to explain capitalist modernity's effects on the internal world as well, in the form of cultural history's attempts to interpret a world in which all that is solid melts into air. All these things were underway, and now in the 1930s, change was already accelerating to an even faster, sustained pace measurable in both increased growth rates. In the 1830s, we first see, many would argue, modern growth rates of 2% or higher that can be sustained. And the momentum of these changes perhaps extends all the way through history to the present. Political and financial innovation was about to feed vast new amounts of credit, tens of thousands of enslaved laborers, into the ever-widening cotton fields of Mississippi. 1833 was also the year when Andrew Jackson began to destroy the Second Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve-like regulator on the American financial economy. And this would unleash state-chartered banks, and they in turn would unleash a bewildering array of financial schemes on the world credit market. These schemes, by the way, often use enslaved bodies as collateral for financial instruments that enabled people in distant cities like London and Amsterdam and New York to invest in the expansion of slavery, while allowing enslavers to borrow more rapidly and to expand the amount of human collateral they held, which led to still more borrowing and buying, of course, in a frenzy familiar to those of us who remember the last decade of financial expansion in the U.S. As a result, back in the 1830s, on the leading, bleeding edge of capitalist expansion, U.S. enslavers would be able in that decade alone to move 250,000 enslaved people from older states like Maryland and North Carolina to new cotton frontiers like Atala County, just during that decade. And by 1837, compared to 1830, that process would have in turn helped to double America's U.S. production of cotton, again, the world's most widely traded commodity. Now, this expansion swelled into a bubble in slave prices, land prices, bond prices, and implicitly a giant bet on the future price of cotton. And eventually, that bubble burst. But as we know, booms and busts shape history, and personal histories too. Thompson recalled in his 1872 account of his own history, an autobiography that was one of more than 100 such accounts published by survivors of enslavement, published during the 19th century, that as the dust of the 1830s cotton and credit boom and bust cycle began to settle, the stability of his own young life was also compromised. His enslaver died, and the estate was reckoned as bankrupt. This is always a dangerous moment for people who were accounted themselves as liquid wealth. 20% of all the wealth in the United States, in fact, in the 1830s, was enslaved human beings. 6 heirs who had their own debtors to satisfy split up the Atala property's enslaved families, sending Charles, his father, and his mother to 3 different places. Moved to one new property in Pontotoc, Mississippi, which was even further into territory that by this point, the early 1840s, had been taken from the Chickasaw. Charles found himself at another key crossroad, one of the key crossroads in any enslaved person's life on the cotton frontier. And that was the first moment he went into a cotton field to work. For young or old, born in Mississippi or forced migrant from the old states, the moment when you stepped into the broken dirt of the cotton field was a moment when you learned things that perhaps you had heard but didn't really know from experience about what it was to be enslaved. People brought from the old states consistently reported that work was more intense in the new ones, the whip that was used was bigger and cut more deeply, and that enslavers deployed it more readily. Charles Thompson, of course, was born in Mississippi, not Virginia, so he didn't have that point of comparison. But just like forced migrants, as a 10 or 11-year-old, he still had to learn new things. And the thing that was always new was that he would never be able to stop learning, or in some ways we might say to stop inventing. And let me explain what I mean by that. Everybody knows about the cotton gin, of course, invented, we're told in 1791, invented, we are told, by Eli Whitney, although it is likely that he assembled it from inventions that were actually carried out by enslaved craftsmen. But he got his name on the patent. But once that bottleneck is taken out of the production process for raw cotton, so the cotton gin pulls out the seeds from the fibers, once that bottleneck is taken out, the bottleneck that remains is the process of picking. People could consistently grow, could plant, cultivate, bring to the point of harvest more cotton than they could actually harvest. So enslavers, Thompson found, pushed enslaved people to pick as fast as they could, relentlessly trying to push through that picking bottleneck. To pick as fast as they could all day long. Let's see. This, by the way, is Charles Thompson's autobiography. And here's a photo from the WPA narratives, or the Federal Writers Project, of an interviewee. This is our other big source for what life was like in the cotton picking season. Interviews done in the 1930s with survivors of slavery. Here we see the spread of cotton. I will come back to that, but this is what I'm looking for. This is one of our earliest known photos of cotton picking from the 1860s. And we don't know if these folks were free or enslaved. But enslaved people in the cotton fields were pushed to pick all day long until dusk fell. And then they carried their cotton back to a central point on the slave labor camp where they worked, and it was weighed. It was weighed. And then the numbers were written down. The weights each person had made during the day were written down on a slate and often would be transferred to a ledger like this. And I always tell people this is essentially a 19th century Excel spreadsheet. You have names as the rows, and then the columns are days, and the numbers are the number of pounds that individuals picked. And if you're close enough, you'll see that quite often the numbers are pretty different. What enslaved people found was that the amount that they could pick when they started, when they were pressed all day long and pushed to pick basically without ceasing from dawn to dusk, that number became a requirement that had to be met each day. Each picker had a stint or daily task to perform, Thompson recalled. That is, each of them was required to pick so many pounds of cotton, and when in default, they were unmercifully whipped. Now, Thompson actually was not very good at this, and so he was in danger for a while. But his slave owner found out that Thompson had an amazing memory, an amazing ability to remember the names and the pounds for any particular weigh-in, at least until the next day had come. So he actually had an innovation that he used Thompson for, which allowed him to sit in the shade for the most part. He would have Thompson and another slave weigh everybody's picking 3 times a day. So in the late morning, in the late afternoon, and then again in the evening. And of course, you can see that this would allow the slave owner even more information about how much people could pick under given circumstances. So Thompson had to perform some feats of mnemonics to remember all the numbers and the names, and certainly an older person in this enslaved labor force would be quite upset if he remembered the name or the number wrong, because it could get them in quite a lot of trouble. But it was the actual cotton pickers who had the harder task, and the task became encoded on sheets like this. Stints or quotas, as I said, were individual. And if Thompson's, if his location was like others, at this slave labor camp where he was, this is not the actual ledger from where he was, it's a representative one from the Natchez area. If it was like others, individual stints or quotas increased over time. Enslaved people like John Brown found that as I picked so well at first, when he was given a 100-pound stint, more was exacted of me, and if I flagged a minute, the whip was liberally applied to keep me up to the mark. By being driven in this way, I at last got to pick 160. And if you think about this increase in the size of the stint for a moment, I believe you'll begin to understand, if you haven't already, many facts of which we historians are still trying to make full sense. Things that never quite made full sense about the process of cotton production. So historians, I think, are still figuring those out, but knowing that the stints increase helps us to do that. For instance, why were enslaved people, why was their labor product weighed every day? Why was it recorded? Why was it ledgered? What did this permit slave owners to do, to learn, to understand? Why were they forced to work all day instead of being given a number to meet as a sort of positive incentive? That happened in some slave systems, but it did not happen by and large in the Cotton South. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, you may have wondered why Patsy, who was the fastest picker, was treated so harshly. And it wasn't just because the enslaver there was seeking to have some sort of sexual relationship with her. It wasn't just that. It wasn't just that the wife of this slave owner was jealous. If you read Solomon Northup's biography, you can see that she was also pressed and whipped because she did not pick fast enough, and yet she was the fastest picker. In fact, we have records from another location, the Bennett Barrow Plantation, as it's called, in Louisiana, which shows that whether you picked fast or whether you picked slow, you could still be whipped for picking too slow. So whether you habitually hit a high production quota, a low one, or in between, you still faced a whipping if you did not meet your quota. Well, I read Charles Thompson's story about 10 or 12 years ago, and I wasn't trying, I'm just going to bounce back to that too. I wasn't trying to write a history of the role of cotton picking in the development of the slave South in the larger development or the larger process of developing American capitalism. I was trying to write a history of the experience of forced migration in the U.S. South before the Civil War, specifically the domestic slave trade and the forced movement of enslaved African Americans from the older states of the South, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, et cetera, to the newer ones like Mississippi, Florida, Texas, Louisiana. And I was looking through these kinds of documents as well as slave owners' documents to try to figure out what that story and what that experience was like from the inside. And certainly that shapes the book to a great extent. But I kept running into these questions that didn't quite fit together, questions like the ones I just mentioned. And in a topic or maybe a way of looking at things that will be, I hope, familiar to historians and archivists, another question: why were certain kinds of documents created, and why were some kinds of documents more common than the others? When I read histories of slavery in the U.S. South, I often read quite a lot about what slave owners were thinking, what they were feeling, what they thought about slavery, what they didn't think about slavery, what they thought about enslaved people, what they didn't think about enslaved people. But I read very little about them as economic actors. It wasn't that nobody was talking about this, right? But most of what was happening, or most of the discussion, was about a sort of theoretical set of ideas that they might or might not have had about industrialization in the modern world and so on and so forth. And most of that was focused on the late 1850s. But I found, instead of that, I found a lot of records that had to do with cotton picking, specifically these kinds of ledgers. These are among the most common, page for page, these are among the most common documents in the history of the South and the historical archives of slave owners or former slave owners. And I found lots of records that had to do with banks and borrowing and buying and selling of slaves, of course, but also the buying and the selling of the credit, if you will, that allowed slave owners to buy and sell slaves. And all of this ultimately pointed me, through my reading of other histories and through my reading of these documents, to the conclusion that what we're looking at when we look at the slave South is not the only origin point, but one of the key origin points of the modern world in which we live. And let me see if I can tie the pieces of that together a little bit. And I think this requires us to step back to the chronological frontier in the broadest sense on which Charles Thompson was born. And this is an overambitious illustration by an economist named Gregory Clark, who does really interesting and controversial work. It's an attempt to portray all of human history in one picture. And the argument that Clark makes, and I think it's consistent with the work of a lot of other historians and economists in many ways, is that for most of human history, since the invention of agriculture anyway, about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, many societies, if not all societies, have been essentially in a sort of Malthusian cycle of advance and retreat, of growing to a size that's the sort of maximum supportable size given a certain set of technologies and a certain number of resources. And thus we have the expansion and then the contraction of, certainly in Chinese history, according to Kenneth Pomerantz, another historian, this happens repeatedly, and we see this in European history as well. The proponents of this theory would argue. It's only between 1750 and 1850 that we see human societies break out of this cycle, for good or for ill, and start to produce much more than the number of mouths that one has to feed can consume. And in fact, to do so with a sufficient number of technological advances, a sufficient increase in efficiency of production, that more can be invested in other areas of economic activity, including the expansion of the efficiency of production still more. And thus we get this sort of recurring cycles of growth, some would argue, in the history of capitalism and of the Western world, and increasingly of the globe since 1750. And it's this key point when growth rates, when income rates for most people in Western societies, not necessarily for enslaved people, when they take off between 1750 and 1850, that we have to look at if we want to explain why this transformation happens, at least why it happens the first particular time. It's that point in history that we have to understand. We have to understand how this transformation happened. And on one level, this is the story of modernization and modernity. These are the key questions, or some of the key questions, that history, economics, and numerous other disciplines were invented to explain. And this created the world that they then continued to explain. This is also the great divergence that finally ensured that the West would dominate the rest, at least until Asia could move once again to economic prominence in the world, as we've seen over the last 50 years. And there have been a host of explanations offered for this historical shift. Some argue that it's a series of crucial key inventions in technology, and clearly that's part of this story, although technologies have been invented time and time again, sometimes the same technologies over and over again. Some would argue that it's the existence of private property as a cultural and legal force in some way that's particular to the West that leads to capitalism. Some would argue that it's a particular cultural capacity for inventiveness that is supposedly found in the West that leads to this kind of transformation. Some would argue that it is government policy and particular kinds of investments, legal changes, et cetera, move away from feudal or mercantile structures of governance that lead to the rise of capitalism. Now, not only economists, but most white historians have routinely rejected, often with, I think I would have to say, ill grace, the Eric Williams thesis, which held that British gains from the Atlantic slave trade helped lead to industrialization. And in fact, Kenneth Pomerantz brings that argument back, and he says, in fact, we need to think of the Caribbean and the U.S. South as the ghost acres, which are contributed to the overall economic growth and economic resources that the West has to draw upon. And I tend to favor that explanation, but I didn't know I was going to try to contribute to the explanation of that macro historical question when I started this process of research. As I explained, I thought I was writing about something else, but I kept finding these other sources which pointed me back to questions of productivity, efficiency, and the question of why enslavers were so interested in credit and why they were so interested in the picking of cotton. Well, let's talk about cotton for just a second, and I'll try to point you to where I went with this. Demand for raw cotton grew exponentially between 1800 and 1860 as the global economy's taste for cotton drove a massive growth in textile factory systems, but production in the U.S. grew even faster than demand. By 1860, this brought the real price of cotton to 25% of its real price per pound in 1800. So it drops to a quarter of what it had been. U.S. producers generated by 1860 88% of the cotton sold in the world's central markets. U.S. production of cotton had increased something like 650 times over, even as the number of enslaved people picking it, pushing through that production bottleneck, had increased only 40 times over. But how did that happen? It was only when I started to listen to Charles Thompson and other survivors of slavery that I found the key that unlocked the puzzle. Because survivors' testimonies, plus the cotton picking spreadsheets, plus the total numbers, plus numerous pieces of enslavers' testimony, revealed that those enslavers had created a diabolical system that's actually more clearly depicted in the film 12 Years a Slave than by and large by professional historians. In this system, slave owners assigned individual picking quotas, weighed each bag at the end of the day or sometimes during the middle of the day, wrote down the total, and whipped each person who failed to meet their particular quota. When an individual figured out how to meet the quota was raised again and again and again. And I started to create a series of observations. And I was sort of beat to the punch by a set of economists who had a whole team of research assistants who were doing this as well. And they found in even more detail what I was finding, which is that the rate of picking increased 4 times over from 1800 to 1860. And by the way, so this is a 400% increase in the efficiency of cotton picking. This is a bottleneck in the system. In factories over the same time period, in English factories, the labor efficiency, aided by machines, the labor efficiency of workers increases in spinning between 400 and 600 or so percent, in weaving between 600 and 1,000%. So slightly more, but it's on the same order of magnitude, right? And this helps to explain why enslaved people supplied so much cotton that they drove down the price even as supply was increasing dramatically. Now, low-priced, abundant raw materials had some pretty important consequences. This allowed factory owners in Britain and Massachusetts to invest the cost savings generated by what I would describe as calibrated torture and ever more efficient machines. And consumers around the world benefited from the cheaper cloth that factories pumped out. And as I said, we'll come back to this one, but this is cotton on the New Orleans levee. But I wanted to make the point that consumers were benefiting so much from the ever cheaper cloth that the system of fashion, as we know it today, grows in no small part as a solution to the problem of cotton oversupply created by the whip-driven efficiency of enslaved African-American stolen labor. Literally, it's in many ways analogous to the U.S. government's by now well-chronicled attempts to get us to consume more corn, right? People have to be convinced to consume cotton in greater and greater quantities. So that's a big part of the story of the book. There are other stories. There's stories about survival. There's stories about resistance. And that's also a crucial part. But certainly this particular story, this story which is at the heart of the development of modern capitalism, the world we live in today, in fact, is something that has certainly gotten a lot of attention. And I think that's fine because I think it's a crucial topic. And there's more to say about it for sure. But certainly one of the goals of the book was to reveal as best I could the ways in which the forced migration of enslaved African Americans was a driving force in the history of the U.S. And I think what we can say is that a 400% system-wide increase in the efficiency of production of the world's most important commodity must be described as a pretty important increase in efficiency. And anything else would be special pleading on behalf of the increasingly untenable claim that slavery hindered rather than helped the rise of British and American capitalism to dominance over the global economy. And in fact, the market marked this unusual efficiency by flocking to American producers of cotton, which by the 1830s are driving out the older cotton-producing regions of the world. They're driving them off the world market and sort of pinning them into domestic consumption, like the Indian cotton sector, which is free people are picking the cotton there. Now, some people find it unlikely that the intensity of labor and various labor management processes, if we want to use that euphemism for what happened in the cotton fields, that this could lead to a fourfold increase of productivity in 60 years. And some people have said, well, that's just not possible. And certainly I'm sure that there are other parts of the story we could tell. Certainly seeds are probably part of the story. Certainly new land is part of the story. But slave owners are mostly focused on getting people to pick cotton faster, and they create a huge amount of documentation to show themselves doing that and show themselves whether or not they're being successful at doing that. And as to the question of whether or not it's possible to increase the efficiency of hand labor by hard driving, measurement, et cetera, by 400% over 60 years, you could consider this. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the originator of so-called scientific management, and his team of stopwatch-wielding assistants claimed that they could increase the productivity of these guys who are carrying pig iron from point A to point B in a railroad yard. They claimed they could increase that 4 times over in a week. And they may have overstated their claims, but the whole field of management studies might beg to differ with the claim that we cannot improve work output by changing incentives. In fact, there are quite a lot of people who are working on that right now. But there are a lot of reasons, in other words, why the half of the story that's about efficiency, productivity, and capitalism's history get a lot of attention right now. Let's think about the implications of the fact that the efficiency of cotton picking grew by 2% per year for what may have been the most crucial 60 years of Western society's transition from subsistence agricultural to high-growth modern economics. We like to think that the industrialization that lifted the Western world from rural backwardness to ever-improving standards of living was produced by clever inventors, factory workers, and captains of industry. But American cotton made by slaves was the key raw material of British and American factories, which mostly made textiles. Millions of people were moved to slavery's frontiers, and like the ones measured by Charles Thomson, they were driven to produce that cotton ever more cheaply. As I said, the plummeting price of cotton enabled investments and accumulations of wealth that went far beyond the cotton fields and the mansions that, in some cases, rose up next to them. In fact, they led to the accumulation of concentrations of wealth that in one form or another are still with us. They're like those first crucial years of savings in a retirement portfolio, but in this case, for an entire society. A refusal to admit the contribution of slavery to this growth is long-standing because that connection has political and intellectual implications. Intellectually, a long-term, highly consequential increase in the productivity of enslaved labor implies that capitalism and freedom do not inevitably go hand in hand, that a rising tide might not only not lift all the boats, but that the water level might be rising because of all the bodies being drowned in it. Politically, it's not a surprise that the question of reparations for slavery often comes up when I make this argument. Although the book doesn't consciously advocate any particular policy or anything like that, if I am correct about the essential role of continuously innovated, intensified, more efficient labor in enabling and sustaining the cascading effects of economic modernization, we are all living off wealth that perhaps could only have been created by slavery, and certainly in this particular world was created in large part by slavery, although of course some of us are much more able to access that wealth than others. I'd like to...
Okay, and we're going to stop our conversation right there. Let me see if I can. Yeah. Okay, and so as we close out our Zoom together, I don't know if this video came out right or not. I hope that it did. I sincerely hope that it did. Forgive me if it didn't. Please give me grace in this moment. I'm trying to balance my household and balance this moment of still being with you guys, even though that I'm going to be at this conference. But I want to make sure that we just reiterate what you saw Edward Baptiste talk about is the nature of the cotton industry. And he described so many different pieces of the industry. One of the things that he definitely starts off by letting us understand is the intensity of the production demand. We know that the demand for cotton grows. I think he even mentions is that people were marketed to consume cotton in a real way as well. So not only is the demand growing, but people are fueling the demand so that the popularity of cotton continues. And because of this, you definitely are going to see, as I mentioned before, a very intense economic kind of criteria that people are trying to satisfy, which is producing large amounts of cotton. And obviously, we see that the disconnect between the production of cotton and the benefits of cotton is that it literally was done off of free labor. And as Baptiste finishes out the conversation, there are many people that benefited from the cotton industry and from the free labor of African people. And so I want to make sure as we close out this module, because the next module we get into kind of hearing the voices of African people and experiencing enslavement from their perspective. We literally put on their shoes and hear their voices and explore their journeys. We focus on some really cool individuals. Some of you might be familiar with them. Some of you may have been hearing these people for the first time. One of which is a woman by the name, I think we're going to focus on Sojourner Truth. Another person by the name of, I think his name is Olaldo. Olalda. It's missing me right now. I think I might be Equiano. That's his name. I'm sorry. So we're going to hear what the voices of the Africans really sounded like and what they would describe when you talk about the nature of slavery. But we are going to close out this module by really making sure that we drive home these sentiments, that the industry of cotton was intense, okay? And that intensity is going to create a hugely violent and hugely toxic culture within the South and within the cotton picking, just any area that is responsible for cotton picking. You're going to see slave breeding farms be a result of this. You're going to see huge moments of violence being a result of this. You're going to see Southern plantation owners become quite literal millionaires during the course of the cotton industry. You're going to see various markets be influenced by cotton. And so for us to really get a genuine sense about what slavery did to America, you have to understand the economic impact that it had. So slavery really definitely is a part of our history that we can't ignore, but it's a part of our history that we have to understand in its totality. So slavery is not just about racism. Slavery is not about just the mistreatment and the dehumanization of African people. Slavery is also about the economic exploitation of a group of people that essentially fuels the development of a whole country. I think at one point in the video, Edward Baptiste says that North America, the Southern plantation owners, they become one of the leading producers in the world of cotton, one of the leading producers of cotton in the world. And so anybody that's able to make that type of money, that type of production, excuse me, is definitely able to demand independence. And so I want to make sure that we are very clear that the industry of cotton bankrolls America, basically, bankrolls America. And even though we see slavery itself being outlawed with the 13th Amendment, initially introduced the concept with the Emancipation Proclamation, but we know that that didn't necessarily free the slaves. We do know by the time you get the 13th Amendment that it legally abolishes slavery for everyone, except if you go to jail. So we know that slavery in itself is just a huge stain, a huge piece also of the fabric of America. And without acknowledging the impact that enslaved Africans had, not only on the rich cultural history of America, but also the economic potential and economic prowess and economic success of America, we also have to acknowledge that as well. So I hope that this was decent enough of a video. I hope that this turns out right. I'm rolling the dice here. Hopefully this is good. But I really wanted to make sure that I still communicated this to you guys, that cotton is king. And when King Cotton comes onto the scene, it literally turns the entire plantation, the entire society, it turns it completely out. And when we get later to the conversation of our class, of our last assignment, which is our final, we get to talk about this thing called reparations. And knowing how extensive the cotton industry was is a very foundational piece for you to develop your understanding of why we demand for reparations, or why there is a demand for reparations now. And I also want to encourage you guys, if you haven't done so already, to consider voting. Okay, and I think Tuesday, which is today, is the voting day. I don't know if you can vote again, or if the ballot boxes are open still. But definitely consider voting, because this is a current topic. Reparations is definitely coming up on so many different ballot boxes in the state of California, that I want to make sure that you guys are aware of that. And for my dual enrollment students, obviously you might want to share with your parents some of the information that you learned about why this thing called reparations is a thing to even be talking about in the first place. So, all right, guys, my timer just went out. I believe that is time up. And hopefully you guys, I'll see you next time, okay? If you need me, you know how to find me. I'm getting ready to go grade your papers now. And yeah, all right, love you, bye. You guys have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your time, and I will see you next week. All right, take good care of yourselves.